Episode 3, Israel Demands a King.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
I'm rising up with a full heart. I'm taking my strength from inside. I'm rising up with a new mind. I'm taking your words to the new behind. I'm coming up from underneath the red.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Thanks for downloading the episode. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on iTunes or Stitcher or YouTube, whatever it is that you're using to listen or download our episodes. If you hit the subscribe button, you won't miss any future episodes. Now, before we get started, this week when we rolled out the podcast, we had a tremendous amount of support on all of our platforms, on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, the website, as well as iTunes. We had a lot of great comments, a lot of great reviews of the show, and I really appreciate it. I'd like to kick off this episode with going over a couple of the reviews that we received on iTunes. A 5-star review from Dark Sim HD. He writes, "High quality episodes discussing Christianity and libertarian philosophy. Count me in." Thanks, Dark Sim. I appreciate it. Danger Tough writes, "Finally, I've been following the website for a while. I'm so excited for this to be in podcast form. Love the site and love the show." Thanks, Danger Tough. I appreciate you following the website, following us there from the beginning. The Lava Flow podcast writes, "Great stuff. Look, I'm an atheist, but I still enjoy the commentary and perspectives that Stephen brings to the table in this podcast. If you're interested in anarchism, this is a great one. Thanks, Lava Flow. I really appreciate it." Simon Jesta writes, "Like the format. Looking forward to future episodes, and I like the short time format. No king but Christ." Thanks, Simon. Again, I appreciate all the feedback we've received. It's comments like this, reviews on iTunes, your likes and shares on Facebook and Twitter that is going to continue to help us grow this podcast and help us get more and more content out to you guys. So I really appreciate it. And you may have noticed that our website has a few changes to it. We have a support tab now. And if you click on the support tab, it'll take you to our Patreon page. On the Patreon page, you'll find a couple of different ways to support us. You can do a one-time donation or a monthly donation. There's a couple of different tiers there with different amounts set up. And if you like what we're doing, if you want to help us out, keep the lights on, keep this content coming, please consider one of these options for donating to the site, and we really appreciate it. Today, I'd like to discuss 1 Samuel 8, the whole chapter. It's not a very popular chapter of the Bible, but it is crucial for understanding Christian anarchism. And there are a lot of verses that are direct supports for Christian anarchism, but I want to get into what I feel is the most important and most recognizable passage from the Bible explaining the way that a Christian should view kings or government. And I want to make it clear that this is just one. I think it's the most important. I think it's the best one to start with. But this isn't a sort of proof text for just picking out a couple of verses here and there that may support your opinion. A lot of people do that. A lot of people do that incorrectly with reading the Bible. They just kind of pick and choose little things, and you can do that when there's one book with 66 books inside of it, and depending on which publication you have, just thousands of pages. And it's easy to just pick out little verses here and there that support your opinion, and you may be completely wrong. And that is something that's usually referred to as proof texting. So that's something that I think as Christian anarchist, it's going to be easy to be accused of that. And it's something that we should stay away from for sure. But of course, I don't have, 10 hours to go through everything in the Bible. So we're just going to take it one at a time. And today, like I said, focus on First Samuel 8. Now, with this passage, I think it's important to note the gravity of it before we get started. And one of my all-time favorite preachers is Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. And in a sermon that he delivered that is titled An Earthly King, which I'll have in the show notes to a couple of different places where you can find that. But he started out his sermon with, I think, a very poignant, a very true statement about 1 Samuel 8. He says, "There were many turning points in their history, but there was no more important or vital a turning point than this particular one, which we are going to deal with. For it is here, as you will see and remember, that these children of Israel insisted upon having a king, an earthly king over them, as the other nations of the world had." Then he goes into a very good sermon that clearly lays out the motivations and the history of Israel leading up to that point. Today, I'd like to go into 1 Samuel 8, looking at it specifically from how it's really relevant to us today. So before we get right into the text, I think it's important that we look into some of the historical context around 1 Samuel. And it's not just this book either, it's every book of the Bible. It's important to know that this is literally happening. This is real history. It's happening at the same time alongside of all the other things that we learn about outside of the Bible with Rome or Greece or Babylon or Egypt. Those events really happened. The books in the Bible really happened. And sometimes I think that we can kind of view it in this vacuum. And so before we get started, I'd just like to note that 1 Samuel happens around 1043 BC. And in the Apologetic Study Bible, there are a couple of notes that I think are important. And it reads, "Historically, these books document the monumental transition that occurred in Old Testament Israel as it moved from being a collection of 12 tribes with no national government to being a unified nation with a centralized government under the control of a king. Furthermore, these books provide a detailed description of the last leaders during the period of the judges, the career of Israel's first king, and the exploits and accomplishments of Israel's most famous king, David." So we've set it up historically. We've heard from the Study Bible. We've heard from Martin Lloyd-Jones about how important this moment in Israel's history, in the Bible, in Christianity, how important this moment is. So let's read through it and consider what it says and why it's important for Christians. Now, in most of your Bible translations, this section of 1 Samuel 8 is titled Israel Demands a King. So that's where we get our title for this episode. And I will be reading from an ESV translation. Israel demands a king. 1 Samuel 8. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. So, stopping right here, we see the way that Israel was set up, as the introduction stated. They did not have a centralized government. It was a organization of judges, and the current judges are the sons of Samuel, the prophet. Verse 4, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. So stopping right there, we see the first instance where Israel has said to Samuel, now appoint for us a king to judge us. And I think the key words here, like all the nations. Verse 6, but the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done from the day I have brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So we see here that God has told Samuel to give them what they want. And he even gives them an interesting, he gives Samuel an interesting line where he says, they have not rejected you. And it's maybe comforting to Samuel, I would assume. But then he says something that's even worse than that. He says, but they have rejected me from being king over them. And so I think that this is something that we do need to consider, that Christians need to spend more time considering, that when this call to have a judge and a king over them like all the other nations is a rejection of God. Picking back up on verse 10, so Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. So stopping right there, God told Samuel, tell the people, this is what will happen if you have a king. And he does. And the first thing that he says is that your sons will be conscripted into the military. I think that's important. I think it's very important as we go through this list that we're about to hear from Samuel, what it means if we have a king over us, a king that we want to appoint over us that is not God. This list directly speaks to what we see today in any nation under any king or government. So moving on, verse 12, and he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. So again, we have a conscription. We have a focus on military weapons. We have labor for the growth of the nation, for the king. Verse 13, he will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. Again, conscription. Verse 14, he will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his servants and his servants. And I think we need to stop right there and look at what that said. A tenth of your grain. Now, this is very important because we've seen previously that a tenth was the tithe of Israel to give to God. And so it's important that we notice that God is telling us that a king will require a tenth. And that message resonated with the people of Israel. They would have seen that what that means is that king is going to set himself up in place of God. He will require what is God's. Verse 16, he will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. Again, conscription. We're seeing this over and over again. Verse 17, he will take the tenth of your flocks and you shall be his slaves. And there we have it. We have the tenth again, and we have blatantly the word slaves is used. In case you didn't get it before, now it's plainly said, you will be a slave. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us, and go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. Samuel then said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. And that concludes this portion of 1 Samuel. And I'd like to make one more note that in verse 19, it says, and they said, no, but there shall be a king over us. And there already was a king over them. But they wanted to have a king like all the other nations, even though they just heard this list of all the atrocities that will befall them when there's a king over them. They still chose that. And I think that the wording that is used is also important. They say that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And that should sound familiar to another point when the people of Israel chose an idol over God, and they said to Aaron, when Moses went on the mountain and received the Ten Commandments, they told Aaron to make an idol, to make a god that would go out before them. And we have the same thing here. And I know it seems hyperbolic sometimes online whenever we have memes or quotes from people that basically say that nationalism or government is just like an idol. But that's what we have here with this language. We're supposed to see this, that the same language is used for a king to go out before them and an idol that they made to go out before them. So that concludes our reading of 1 Samuel 8, and I'd like to encourage you to go back through there. If you need to reread it in the Bible, don't take my word for it. Read it again and again. Check out what other people have to say about it. Now, to end it, though, I'd like to revisit Martin Lloyd-Jones and the sermon that I mentioned from the beginning. The rest of Samuel goes on to have much more dialogue between Samuel and the people of Israel over their decision. And I think Martin Lloyd-Jones sums it up greatly with their discussions after Samuel has told the people what God says about kings and their new central government. We're fortunate to have many recordings of Dr. Jones, but I'd like to read out just a small excerpt from the end of his sermon. Samuel said unto the people, fear not, you have done all this wickedness, yet turned not aside from following the Lord, but served the Lord. with all your heart, and turn ye not aside, for then ye should go after vain things, which cannot profit nor deliver you, for they are vain. Repentance with a whole heart, keeping nothing back, an entire surrender to God, with all your heart. That's what he demands. And that includes turning away from everything else, which is vanity, which is idle. Trusting in your kings, trusting in your learning, your scholarship, your organization, your pomp and power, your money, and all their enticing attractions. Turn away from their vanity. So I think it's important to note that what Dr. Jones points out and the words from Samuel, that this king and the trust that they put into the king and their other idols is vanity. And that concludes our review of 1 Samuel 8. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, leave us a note on Facebook or Twitter, the website, or iTunes. Let me know what you think. And other than that, I'll see you next time. No king but Christ.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
This has been a Pax Libertas Productions podcast.